Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating, profound shift in how we understand the world, a shift mapped out in Rebecca Solnit's book, The Beginning Comes After the End. Look, I think we can all agree the world feels incredibly fragmented right now, right? Things feel chaotic. But Solnit actually brings together these amazing threads from evolutionary biology, forestry, and history to make a really interesting argument. She suggests we aren't just watching things fall apart. We're actually witnessing the messy end of one worldview and the very beginning of another. So let's explore the data and the historical shift she highlights to really get a handle on what this emerging perspective is all about. To make sense of a massive societal shift like this, we first need to look at biology. And to do that, I gotta ask you a question. What actually happens inside a chrysalis? We all know the elementary school version of the story, right? A caterpillar goes in, hangs out for a bit, and a beautiful butterfly comes out. It sounds so elegant, so peaceful. But the biological reality of that metamorphosis is actually the central metaphor Solnit uses for our current era of cultural change. And let me tell you, what happens inside that little cocoon is anything but elegant. Okay, so here's the wild part. The caterpillar completely falls apart. It literally turns to goo. Inside that chrysalis, it dissolves into this biological slurry. But, and this is the key, within that slurry are these dormant entities called imaginal cells. They're basically the blueprints for the new butterfly. Now, what's really crazy is that the dissolving caterpillar's own immune system doesn't even recognize these new imaginal cells. It thinks they're alien invaders and actually goes on the attack. But the imaginal cells survive. They multiply, and eventually they pull that biological goo together into an entirely new creature. Solnit uses this messy, conflict-heavy process as a metaphor for our own turbulent era. The friction, the pushback, the feeling that absolutely everything is falling apart. Well, in this framework, those are just the classic symptoms of a transitional phase. The next era comes after the end of the last one, and in between, yeah, there's a whole lot of falling apart. According to Solnit, society is currently stuck right in the middle of a transition between two totally different paradigms. The first is what she calls the ideology of isolation. That's the worldview we are allegedly leaving behind. It's all about separation, fierce competition, and viewing the world as just a collection of static nouns, like isolated objects. But emerging from the goo, so to speak, is the ecology of interconnection. This new paradigm focuses on cooperation, mutual aid, and viewing the world as active, ongoing verbs. Solnit argues that a lot of the tension we feel in the modern world is just the friction of moving from that older paradigm of isolation into this much more interconnected one. So let's look at where this older paradigm came from. Where did we get this intense focus on individualism and isolation? Solnit points to a few major historical milestones. First up is Garrett Hardin's really influential 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. That piece argued that humans are just inherently selfish and will always deplete shared resources. She also points to foundational economic theories, like Adam Smith's. The argument here is that his theories largely ignored all the unpaid cooperative labor, like, say, the care provided by his own mother, that actually makes individualism possible in the first place. Finally, she highlights social Darwinism, which basically took evolutionary science and misapplied it to justify societal inequality by framing all of survival as just ruthless physical competition. According to Solnit's framework, these were the building blocks that taught us to see ourselves as autonomous, competing islands. But modern science is starting to tell a very different story. Consider this staggering biological fact, which really forms the bedrock of this new interconnected paradigm. Right now, as you sit there, about 50% of the cells in your body do not contain human DNA. Just let that sink in for a second. Half of the cells making up you aren't actually human. Because of that 50%, Solnit points out that you are absolutely not a singular, isolated individual. You are, to use her exact phrase, a lurching collective of mutually beneficial entities. It's true. Your gut, your skin, your mouth, they're all heavily populated ecosystems. You are basically hosting trillions of bacteria and microbes that are absolutely crucial for your digestion, your immune system, your very survival. The science of the human microbiome shows us that the ideology of isolation kind of fails at a basic biological level. You literally can't be an autonomous island when your existence relies on this massive unseen party of guests cooperating inside you every single second of the day. And we're seeing this exact same shift play out in ecology too, especially when we look at forests. For decades, the traditional timber industry viewed a forest strictly through that lens of isolation. Trees were seen as totally separate entities, just competing fiercely for sunlight, water, and nutrients. Anything else was a weed to be eliminated. But then, researchers like Suzanne Simard discovered what's now famously called the Wood Wide Web.
We now know that there are massive underground networks of fungi connecting these trees, literally allowing them to share resources like nitrogen and phosphorus, even across entirely different species. It's incredible. The science tangibly shifted from assuming ruthless competition to revealing this deeply complex cross-species cooperation. Ecologist Suzanne Simard captures this broader shift perfectly. She notes, ecosystems are so similar to human societies. They're built on relationships. They build cohesiveness, exchange, complexity. Modern biology is directly challenging those old, overly simplistic views that nature is just a brutal battlegrounds where only the strong survive. Instead, the data is showing us that nature is a highly collaborative, self-organizing network. And once we recognize that ecosystems thrive on these complex relationships, it becomes a lot easier to leave behind the notion that society should just be driven by zero-sum competition. What's really fascinating is that this shift in Western scientific understanding actually brings it right into alignment with much older indigenous worldviews. Solnit brings in the work of botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer here, who points out how fundamentally language shapes our reality. Kimmerer says, "Those whom my ancestors called relatives were renamed natural resources. In contrast to verb-based Potawatomi, the English language is made up primarily of nouns. Think about how profound that is for a minute. When you view the world as a collection of static nouns, just resources, it becomes incredibly easy to exploit and deplete them. But when your language uses verbs to describe a living, dynamic relationship with nature, you treat those elements as relatives. The language of isolation created resources. The language of interconnection creates relationships." And that brings us to a major philosophical conclusion drawn straight from all this new evolutionary and ecological science. Life itself is a constant exchange. It's a nonstop process of taking in what isn't us, like food, water, oxygen, and putting out things that interact with the environment. Because life is a constant flow, we aren't static objects frozen in time. We are not nouns. We are verbs. We are an ongoing active process of integration with the world around us. Embracing this means fundamentally rethinking our place in things, realizing we're active participants in a vast web, not just isolated objects sitting on top of the earth. Now, you might be wondering, how does a society actually transition to a totally new worldview like this? Well, it definitely doesn't happen overnight. Solnit maps out a timeline to show that what feels like a sudden cultural revolution is actually the result of decades of slow, incremental groundwork. Back in the 1950s, things like nuclear fallout and chemical pesticides forced a systemic awareness that our actions have invisible, sprawling consequences. Then, in the 60s, the civil rights and anti-war movements showed that ordinary, organized people could pull off what looked like social miracles. And today, in the 2020s, we're seeing the cumulative harvest of all those seeds, a mainstream recognition of our deep ecological and cultural interdependence. The change is slow, but when you zoom out, the distance we've traveled is actually monumental. Recognizing this long, ongoing history of change is so vital because it really equips us for the future. The anthropologist David Graeber captured this beautifully. He said, "The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make and could just as easily make differently." If the ideology of isolation was just a framework built by specific thinkers over a few centuries, well, that means it's not some inescapable law of physics. It's just a system we made up. And the big takeaway here is that armed with a new understanding of how deeply interconnected we really are, we actually have the agency to build a very different kind of framework. Which brings us right back to where we started today, the chrysalis. The old world, characterized by isolation and extraction, is undergoing a really messy, highly contested dissolution. It's turning to goo. The imaginal cells are getting to work, and the immune system of the old paradigm is, unsurprisingly, fighting back. But the biological imperative is moving toward metamorphosis. Solnit leaves us with a really profound question to chew on as we navigate all this transition. If we are indeed witnessing the end of an era defined by separation, and this complex, interdependent butterfly is getting ready to emerge, what beginnings come after such an end? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it gave you a structured, fascinating look at the deep shifts happening right beneath our feet.